To another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here, and on today's episode we have friend of the program Matt Nelson joining us again to cover some conference championship games. We're going to start our analysis on the SEC championship, Alabama at Georgia once again, and it's going to be a nice little rematch in a number of different ways. And I guess, Matt, as I was thinking about this game, it kind of dawned on me that there's only been 3 teams who have won the SEC championship in the past decade: Alabama, Georgia, and LSU. So the top of the mountain of the SEC has not changed, but I think in many ways this will probably be the best matchup of the weekend, if you ask me, because there's just so many different aspects and layers and perspectives that you can kind of look at in terms of what could happen. So, Matt, with that said, what are your kind of overall thoughts in this game, and what do you think are going to be kind of the key factors to victory for Georgia and Alabama?
We'll see if Alabama can get Ryan Williams going. He's been kind of hit or miss, and I know he can be definitely a big weapon downfield for Alabama. But I'm looking at Georgia. Here's your opportunity. You felt like you didn't play as good as you should have, as you thought you were going to earlier on in the year. And everybody also knows that early season football is completely different than the football games you play, going into November. That's kind of all I've heard from several of the people that I know that are Georgia fans. They're we're waiting for this. Please give us this return. Please give us this matchup again. And all right, here you go. This is what you've asked for. So I think if you're a Georgia fan, before you go into the playoff, you're just really hoping that you can show up and that this is a different Georgia team than that played the first time. And I think if you're Alabama, you're really trying to show something here. You felt like you didn't get started off, at the beginning of the year correctly, and losing to a Florida State game. But again, as we talked about, September football is much different than late October going into November football. They're a completely different team, and I would definitely tell you you're in the correct talking about how good of a game it's going to be. It'll certainly, I think, be a barn burner. It could come down to who has the ball last.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a couple different ways you can kind of look at this, right? Because if I had to summarize this game into kind of a couple key points, I'd say first and foremost, I think this comes down to, obviously in the trenches. I think one of the big storylines for me is who's going to be able to protect their quarterback better, especially now that Drew Bobo, who's Mike Bobo's offensive coordinator's son, is going to be stepping in there. And, he's had some injury issues, so we'll see what kind of happens in that front. Obviously, the adaptability in terms of, which coach is going to be able to make the right adjustments in the right moments. Because just as you aforementioned a couple seconds ago, it could very well come down to that last drive, or very well could come down to that, hey, do you stick the nail in the coffin to that 4th and 2nd or 4th and 3rd, or do you trust that defense to punt the ball away? And also, too, I think 3rd down conversions is going to be a big aspect of this game because, I think back to the first matchup, and one of the big reasons why I think Alabama won that game was just because of how tactical Ty Simpson was on 3rd down. I mean, they went 13 for 19 on 3rd down attempts, and especially when it's a 3-point game, those are the differences between winning and losing. And not to mention, too, Georgia's pass rush was very ineffective in that game. You're starting to see glimpses of it towards the end of the season, and obviously a way more complete Georgia team. But nevertheless, I think there's going to be a couple key points that, if I were to summarize, that's what I think fans should be looking out for.
Yeah, and you mentioned pass rush. I mean, I think that could also be a big key factor there too. Are you able to affect the quarterback play? Are you able to get turnovers? A turnover in the first quarter is wonderful, but a turnover late 3rd quarter, going into the 4th, that could as you mentioned, also be a nail in the coffin. Um, we've seen it happen before. Going. You get all the way down. You go look at the Iron Bowl just this past weekend. We think Auburn's driving down to maybe perhaps upset Alabama, and then what happens? Alabama gets the fortunate enough to have the fumble, and that kind of eventually seals up the game. I'm curious to see if maybe something happens like that, in the championship game this weekend. Maybe, Alabama forces a turnover. Maybe, the Georgia pass rush gets on Ty Simpson late, forces him into, an awkward throw, or, maybe they get a fumble. I think that's definitely also something to, keep your eye on this weekend.
Yeah, because I definitely want to focus a little bit more on Alabama's offense, right? Because we can all agree Ty Simpson is legit Heisman Trophy candidate. I think he's exceeded expectations this year. Just somebody who's played with poise, and it's a testament to kind of the Alabama way, right? Of hey, if you sit and you watch some of the best in college football do what they do, hey, we're going to develop you. We're going to coach you. We're going to mentor you. And that kind of system has worked not only under Nick Saban, but also it's paid dividends under Kalen DeBoer, because if you look at them statistically, Kalen DeBoer is 9-2 versus AP top 25 teams when played in November or later. So it's not like Kalen DeBoer hasn't got the job done. And I'll be the first to admit, I've definitely been critical of him enough times on this show, but I definitely need to start showing him some more love. But at least offensively speaking, another thing I want to mention too is where's Ryan Williams been? Alabama has so many key playmakers, right? And I guess I just haven't seen him have that kind of explosive game, that big moment game where he really takes over, right? Because now with Jam Miller having some injuries and all that stuff too, it kind of makes me wonder what direction does Ryan Grubb go in terms of how to best exploit this Georgia defense, who, by the way, I think has played better and better and better as the year has kind of progressed, starting with that dominant win in Starkville a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I think you have to go in and look at, how they're going to script it up. Is it going to be one of those ones where you start off using the run game to kind of try to open up the pass? Is it going to be, hey, we're just going to go up top, maybe early on and just see if we can kind of catch him sleeping? You've seen, kind of glimpses this season of, Ryan Williams, when he has shown up in moments throughout games. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, I would tell you the first half has just kind of been, you know, quiet on the home front as far as, all the talk that I feel like I heard, going into the season about how great Ryan Williams was and how we need to watch out for him. He's about to, bust out and just have this, phenomenal season. And you just kind of haven't seen that. It's just really been, I want to say eye opening, but also kind of like, wow, like I wonder sometimes if that we put so much hype and expectations onto a player such as Ryan Williams that we get in here and we just expect every week to see him, 100 yards and a touchdown, 100 yards and a touchdown, where yes, it hasn't been necessarily that, but it hasn't been that at all. It's not even like he's getting, 50 yards here, 70 yards here, 80 yards here. Like you didn't hear from it at all. He might have had, 2 catches in one game, 1 catch in another, maybe 3 catches here. And so, yeah, I think if you're Alabama, maybe you have to start, even scripting it up. If you say, all right, well, we're going to go out here, we're going to have, maybe a bubble screen to Ryan Williams, or maybe we're going to try to hit him on a slant. Like if he's your guy and you really want him to be involved, do you think that he's going to help you win this, not only this SEC championship, but go far in the playoff? Then yes, you have to script in some plays and have to, actually get him involved in your passing game.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you kind of elaborated on that too, because one of the things I was thinking about too is, Alabama, they do have other weapons, right? You have Jeremy Bernard, you have Isaiah Horton, Jam Miller is obviously a solid threat in the passing game when he's healthy too. But I'm really glad you didn't kind of elaborate too much on the games last week in terms of, I've heard a lot of people criticizing Gunnar Stockton because he wasn't looking that hot versus Georgia Tech. And then obviously the Iron Bowl comes down to the last minute, which, as history has shown, it's always a relatively close game, especially when you think back a couple of years ago when the infamous 4th and 30, that miraculous play that happened in Jordan-Hare Stadium. So I'm glad we're not talking too much about rivalry week, because in many ways, I always think those games are going to be relatively competitive and you just can't hone in on just one of those instances in terms of talking about this kind of matchup too, because I think even though we kind of know what the strengths are of both teams and relatively speaking what the weaknesses are, anytime that I've seen it, relatively speaking, the second game is usually always even closer than the first game.
Yeah, I think you have to go back to, I think if you were going to, not in any necessary order, but I think if you're looking at three key things, I know, when you watch, college football Saturday, you watch ESPN, they always talk about, well, here are the three key factors. I think number one, definitely has to be, like you said, protection of the quarterback. How clean could you keep your guy? I think number two definitely has to be turnovers. Who's going to force that turnover? If there's only one turnover, the entire game, but either say Alabama or Georgia wins by 3 or 7, and one of those teams has a turnover, and that's where those extra points came from, that could definitely be the deciding factor. And then I think number three definitely has to be, how good are you going to be offensively? And I know that sounds so simple, but I mean, think about this. It's if you can get one side of your offense running, we always talk about how the run opens up the pass. Well, sometimes the pass opens up the run as well. And I think it's just going to be interesting to see how these two offenses kind of get things started and if they can keep it humming along, even for just a couple quarters. I think it's going to be an interesting game. I don't necessarily know that it's going to be extremely high scoring. I feel like the defenses are going to play well. So I think you could see either side win this, maybe, 27-24, something like that, maybe a 24-21 game.
Yeah, so I have a two-part question for you to kind of hone this all together. First and foremost, who do you think is going to win this game? And then secondarily, if Alabama were to lose this game and they become a three-loss team, how do you think that impacts their overall playoff chances?
It's tough because you never want to count Alabama out. Doesn't matter, whether they have one loss or two losses. But again, as we talked about, I start to think that this Georgia team could be different than the one that played them earlier and that only lost by a score. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you I think that Georgia wins a tight one here. 27-24. I could easily see Alabama going down and getting held and all having to settle for a field goal to go up 24-20. And then I could see, Gunnar Stockton putting together a long drive to, push Georgia over, and they end up winning 27-24. As far as three losses, I could still see them getting in, and here's why, is because having three losses in the regular season is a lot different than making it to your conference championship, in my opinion, and then getting your third loss there. Because you've made it here. We know that you've done enough in the regular season in your conference to make it to the title game, that it shouldn't be such a deciding factor if you lose, as opposed to, let's take Texas, for instance, who has three losses in the regular season. And we're talking about, them on a side. Is that, do you think they should get in? Do you think they should not? To me, they're completely different than, say Alabama, who's trying to still get in, but you've made it to your conference title game. And so I think if they lose, if it's a close one, if Georgia wins at the end, whether by touchdown or a field goal, I think you could see them slide in maybe. I think it might be, though, maybe at a 10 seed, though. They may drop a couple. I could still see them getting in, though. Again, like I said, you've made it to your conference title. It's, if it's a close game. Now, if they get blown out somehow, if Georgia ends up winning, 34-17 or, 41-21 or something like that, then you probably slide out, and who knows, who sneaks in if that is the case. So the best case for Alabama, just win, and you should be perfectly fine.
And that's the $1 million question, right, in terms of what happens if Alabama were to lose this game, because that's really the tightrope walk that you're kind of having if you're the committee, is you want to obviously reward teams for getting their SEC championship and playing an extra game, but you also have to penalize them in the sense, well, if Alabama gets their ass whooped and they have three losses, well, you have teams like BYU, Vanderbilt, Utah, and Michigan and all these other teams fighting for a spot. So, and I think the committee is sensitive to that, even though we've shown at times where they've been inconsistent. I think they are aware that that could be a possibility, but I, was going back and forth about this, and I've seen a lot of other media outlets and a lot of other bettors primarily have Alabama winning this game. I think a large part just because of the historical implications and victories that they've had. But I'd say my money's got to be on Georgia here, and I think Georgia because to me Georgia feels like a team that's. This isn't just because I picked him as my national champion, so we're not. It's not just because of that, but the biggest thing is they are progressively getting better and better each game. Where I feel like Alabama has kind of has had up and downs. Like when I go back and think of that Missouri game, I instantly think to myself another play or two, and I think we're having a completely different conversation. And